Welcome to this slideshow on F585 OCR 2016 Stimulus Extract 3. Extract 3 deals with primary commodity dependence and the terms of trade, and also gives us some more indicators of development in Zambia. So, how dependent is Zambia on primary commodities? Well, not only is it very, very dependent on primaries, it's particularly dependent on one in particular, and that's copper. Copper accounts for 3/4 of all the export earnings that Zambia gets. And it goes on to say that the rise in commodity prices such as copper can provide tax revenue which can be used for infrastructure, education, healthcare to improve the supply side of the Zambian economy. Obviously it could also improve aggregate demand. Other benefits that might come from copper boom, copper prices rising, would be not only more tax revenue but increased employment in the Lusaka copper belt in particular, investment by multinationals, and improved terms of trade. Largely it was an increase in copper prices, particularly between 2007 and 2013, which accounts for this great improvement in their GNI per capita. When their terms of trade worsened, when copper prices went down, that accounts for some of the fall in GNP between 2000 and 2007. Other key things you're meant to draw out from this is that life expectancy has increased quite dramatically in Zambia, that primary school enrollment has increased too, and the number of years that children spend in school has increased over the last 10-15 years. Although as a proportion of the expected years, the number of years people are expected to go to school, so for example in Britain people will be expected to go to school between the ages of 5 and now 17. The proportion that is being met is not as great at the end of the period as the beginning, indicating some mismatch between expectations and reality. But for all the improvement in Zambia, it has been one of the fastest growing economies in the last 15 years. It hasn't translated into a huge amount of poverty reduction for Zambia. It's a very, very poor country, and the number of people as living in absolute poverty has increased over the last years, partly because although Zambia during the copper boom did grow economically quite considerably, so did its population, which has reduced per capita increases in GNI, and also has increased the absolute number of poor people in Zambia. So if we look at some more development stats, we can see that some of them are really quite scary. It is a country which is very, very young, owed to a very high birth rate, the 4th highest in the world. Mothers don't have much of a life before they start bearing children. The average age they start bearing children is 19.3, and then they go on to have on average 5.72 children. The maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates are quite high, and for an example, in 2014 over 1 million people died of AIDS. It is a country very much still in the developing phase, even if as we saw from one of the earlier extracts, the IMF has upgraded it to a lower middle income country. These next few slides are courtesy of Tutor to You. Just give you a few more statistics thanks to them. You can see that these poverty measures show that it's still quite a poor country, and that it is one of the most unequal countries in the world. The reason for that is during the copper boom, incomes rose in the copper belt of Lusaka, whilst the countryside remained one of the poorest areas of the world, and also having a lucrative industry like copper allows politicians to be corrupt if they so choose, which also increases inequalities. So now we go on to primary commodity dependence. Let's have a look at some theory on this. Well, one thing to bear in mind is that we can use the term terms of trade to discuss the effect of primary commodities on Zambia. And the terms of trade is the index of average export prices divided by the index of average import prices. And so what you're looking at here is something rather different from the balance of trade. It's the ratio of prices of exports to imports, with the suggestion that if your terms of trade improved, you would be earning more foreign exchange. Zambia, if the copper prices went up, on average, the price of its exports, which is mostly copper, would go up, and then it would be able to buy more imports with the more valuable exports. Yes, you'd think, well, if your terms of trade are improving, you're less competitive. But bear in mind that in the peculiar kind of market that these commodity-dependent countries work, they have no price-setting power. So they don't undercut or sell more copper if it's cheaper. They don't sell any less when it's more expensive. The price is really determined in world markets, and as a small, only 4% of world production, they can sell as much as they want realistically. The terms of trade, the average export prices over the average import prices, improving when it goes up and deteriorating or worsening when it goes down. As we can see from this chart of the exports of Zambia, the brown colour indicates metals, of which the vast majority here, 69%, is copper, or even more if you include copper wire down the bottom there and copper plating. You can see how dependent Zambia is on copper. Now have a look at imports. Look how it has to import quite a lot of ore, copper ore, obviously in order to use some of its refineries, but it needs machines and chemicals and other metals, plastics and transportation. All of this stuff largely seems to be in order to keep the copper industry going. So it's the kind of capital goods required, advanced capital, in order to do mining. There's very little down here which one would suggest might be some sort of luxuries or imported goods for consumption. So that means that Zambia is very sensitive to changes in its terms of trade. When its terms of trade improve, as they do in the first part of this graph quite dramatically, the copper exports earn Zambia an awful lot of money, dollars, which they can use to buy the machines and tools required to expand their copper industry, and a virtuous circle ensues. When they dip, as they did in 2009, following the world financial crisis, Zambia's income plummets because mines close down, mines can't afford to pay people, they can't afford to buy any imports because their terms of trade have suddenly worsened, so they can't invest. What you don't see in this graph is that world commodity prices have absolutely tumbled. The terms of trade in Zambia will therefore have tumbled much further and worse than even the dip shown here, and that has caused all sorts of trouble for Zambia. As a result, the kwacha has devalued by a large amount, which will lead to even worsened terms of trade for Zambia. The other thing that we might consider is during this boom, particularly from 2000 to 2006, did these high terms of trade for Zambia cause their currency to increase and therefore cause Dutch disease? And I think that it's quite clear, really, in terms of proving the dependence of Zambia on copper prices and in terms of trade more generally, that this dip here corresponds with 1922 on the chart there, in terms of lower GDP per capita at that point. So let's have a look at primary commodity dependence as a theory debate. On the one hand, because of the law of comparative advantage that David Ricardo expounded in the classical period, it makes sense for Zambia to specialise in the product that it has an advantage in, and it will have an advantage in copper because it has the factors of production required for copper. That's our friend the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, that you specialise and have a comparative advantage in what you have relatively abundant factors of production to produce. On the other hand, and looking at the theory debate, being specialised can cause an increased reliance on an undynamic industry. That would be certainly more the case if Zambia was specialised in primary production that was agriculture, because that can be very basic and very capital light. Mining, I suppose, is reasonably high tech at times, which isn't so undynamic, but generally it doesn't promote the kind of learning by doing, interesting technique and technology, and embodiment of brand new and fancy capital. There's lots of capital, but it's going to be big and heavy, that creates a sort of creative energy or dynamic efficiency, which is growth. Of course, being so specialised can cause problems of over-specialisation, of which volatility is a clear one, which we'll explain in a minute, and the other is Dutch disease, which we have discussed in class. The main idea is that if you become very specialised in a natural resource, that natural resource will sometimes go through booms of high value. That'll pull your currency up, making other industries wither because they can't compete with your high currency. And when the natural resource price plummets, you'll find that you can't diversify into other currencies. And indeed, there's quite a lot of evidence that this is the problem for Zambia, and that countries blessed with natural resources do worse than those without, suggesting that this is a curse, which we call the natural resource curse, or Dutch disease. And please always make sure that you put a green point in your answers, and consider how having such a large amount of mining in a country has a nasty impact on the environment in all sorts of ways, and it's very unsafe for the workers. So let's just run through the analysis of why you're so volatile if you specialise in a primary commodity. Well, the first thing is that primary commodities operate in a market which is closest to perfect competition. That's because each country that's a primary producer tends to produce only a small proportion of the world market. The product is homogeneous, that means it's identical, copper is copper is copper, and it's quite easy to find out the copper price. So the supply and demand model for the global copper market is appropriate. That means that Zambia is a price taker. The world supply, world demand determine the price of copper, and Zambia just has to take that world price. Point 2, supply and demand are inelastic. Supply is obviously inelastic because it's difficult to gouge more out of a mine suddenly in response to higher world prices. You have to invest in more mines and more equipment, so it takes a long time for supply to be elastic. And that copper is demand inelastic because it's needed for all electronic circuit boards and for building and copper wires and so on. So it's a derived demand and inelastic. Now, why is it a derived demand? It's because a demand for copper is derived from the demand for the growth and expansion of the world economy, particularly in terms of increased manufactured products and building. So, for example, when Chinese aggregate demand falls and it slows down, this means there's less demand for building materials, which means less demand for copper, which means demand for copper falls. Supply is inelastic, so price is going to go down a lot. Let's have a look at that on a diagram. Here's your inelastic supply and demand for copper. We know it's the right model because it's like perfect competition. We know it's steep because both are inelastic. When there's a copper boom, say pulled up by the growth of China and the world economy, like most of the period between 1990 and 2014, you can see the price of copper went up, Zambia's terms of trade improved, and it felt like it was doing very well. On the other hand, after 2014, particularly because of the Chinese slowdown, the demand for copper has fallen. The price of copper has therefore fallen greatly. The Zambian terms of trade has worsened very significantly, and it's stuffed because its revenues have gone down a lot. If you think of the rectangular area under the curve, you can understand how much its revenues have decreased. And really, this is an unsurprising thing. Copper always cycles. It's typical in primary products for the price to cycle over the long term as high prices drive investment, more mines open, that can cause oversupply, prices collapse, supply is less incentivized, and demand gradually picks up, supply is inelastic in the short run, prices go up, and so on. The last major price collapse was in the 70s, which caused a similar crisis in Zambia as they've experienced in the last year or so. And at that point, they nationalised the mines. That was 1978. So there is precedent for this resource nationalisation if we look at the economic history of Zambia. It was a complete disaster, the nationalisation of the mines. They were incredibly inefficient, and it was only in 1990 when they were privatised, that means denationalised, that there was a sustained period of investment, and coupled with the rising world copper prices, very high rates of growth for Zambia. We've seen it all before. So, let's move on now to the subject of multinationals and their role in Zambia. So bear in mind, in terms of syllabus economics, you can discuss globalization and development, the role of multinationals, the arguments pro and con, and there's some nice specifics in the extract to do with multinationals. So here we have copper accounting for a huge amount of Zambia's export revenue, but only 10% to government tax revenue. They gave you the clue earlier in the extract, didn't they, that tax revenue could be used for good purposes. Zambian government has expressed concerns that they have been evading tax. Well, certainly they might have been avoiding tax. They can buy services from their other divisions in low tax countries. For example, Glencore has its head office in Jersey, or at least it does for accounting purposes, which is a low tax area. Now, that will reduce their tax bill at home in a process known as transfer pricing. And there might be other ways that they can avoid tax through either other complicated international money movement and tricks, or through using corruption to get favourable tax deals, and they may be evading tax, which is not paying it illegally. And if you look at some of the charities, War on Want here has produced a report saying that it costs Zambia $3 billion a year for their the War on Want call corporate tax dodging. These great big multinationals have many, many ways to reduce their tax bill, and the argument here is that is contributing to Zambia's poverty, because if they had this money, they could invest it wisely. I think that it's certainly true that they could invest it wisely. Unfortunately, if there are countries with a high degree of corruption, or well-meaning but ultimately poor policy choices, you can't guarantee that any reclaimed tax would be of benefit. Anyway, it certainly doesn't seem that it's benefiting Zambia very much in the pockets of these multinationals. So what are they doing? Well, they've threatened to take control of these companies in resource nationalisation. That is, we're going to nationalise the companies that extract our natural resources. They've raised the royalty on the mining tax, and they've withheld VAT refunds from mining companies. In other words, as it grabbed more tax than they should have done according to the rules, in order to try and claw back some money that they feel unfairly the multinationals have got. And if they manage to acquire a 51% stake, the government, in these mining operations, then of course that would be renationalisation, as in 1978. And it's been the basic government election strategy to promise the people that they'll get the money back from the copper mines. And also in an energy crisis, you can add to that reduce the amount of cheap energy that's being given to the copper companies. And it does look rather unfair, doesn't it? Let's have a look at Zambia, a GDP of $61 billion a year, against Glencore, one of the multinational companies that's involved in Zambian mining. Glencore is considerably bigger than Zambia, and Glencore's owner here is worth about $7 billion in his own on his own right, never mind the company. This seems a little unfair, and that's an indication of global inequality if you think the number of Zambians who are living on less than $2 a day. So, what are the other disadvantages of multinationals other than tax avoidance? Well, that obviously profits are not repatriated necessarily. The profits are repatriated and don't stay necessarily in Zambia. They don't necessarily use local employees, so skill and human capital is less likely to diffuse than maybe we would hope in theory with FDI. They might cause tremendous environmental damage, and they are footloose. They can leave when they want, and that gives them a huge amount of power to avoid tax, to put pressure on governments threatening to leave, you see, and when they do leave, or if they just moving money around their divisions for currency gain, that can cause considerable fluctuations in a country's currency, which can render it uncompetitive, cause Dutch disease and so on. But we must bear in mind that multinationals are responsible for this high degree of FDI, which has caused the growth in Zambia and lifted it from being, in the very poorest countries in the world to being a lower middle income country. The extract argues that some economists are worried that greater state involvement and higher taxes might discourage investment in mining and other sectors of the economy, that's discourage FDI, resulting in a reduction in the growth and output. You should be pretty familiar with why the reduction in FDI would reduce growth, and all this uncertainty due to the confiscatory words of the government has caused even worse problems with companies closing mines or threatening to close. And indeed, to an extent, the Zambians have given in to the multinationals on this, so desperate are they for their contribution. Remember that FDI is vital to avoid the development trap, that poor countries have very little in the way of savings which can go into banks, which can be invested by companies for the economy to grow on the supply side, that the multinational companies account for a lot of the lucrative employment in Lusaka, which keeps people in jobs, and nationalising the copper mines is not the best of both worlds necessarily if nationalised industries are inefficient. So that was my brief presentation on Extract 3. Further extension work might be to learn a little bit more about the development indicators in Zambia, and in terms of multinationals, see where the to and fro between governments raising taxes and the multinationals holding them to ransom and them having to cut their taxes again has got to, because all my research has shown it's gone this way and that, and it's hard to keep up. I hope you enjoyed the recording. There's more stuff on the website.